Mr. President. The amendment that was just defeated was to hold us to the '08 spending levels after the $1 trillion of stimulus spending that has already been passed and signed by the President. My amendment would be for the non-security spending for '08 plus the rate of inflation at 3.8%. Basically, what I'm doing is asking that we commit the bill back to the Appropriations Committee to amend and find the places in the Omnibus bill that is before us or the stimulus bill from last 2 weeks ago where we would take out the amount of spending that is duplicative or non-essential in the amount of approximately $12 billion. Mr. President, this is a very modest cut, but it would begin to put us on the road toward some fiscal responsibility. We have just passed a $1 trillion stimulus package. It is in all of the areas that we could spend money on, and many of those are duplicated in what we are taking up on the floor right now. So if you take the non-security spending of '08 and you add the rate of inflation at 3.8, the Congressional Budget Office says that it would be about $12 billion in cuts that the Appropriations Committee would be able to find. So we're not saying slash across the board. We're certainly holding harmless defense and veterans. But we're saying that the Appropriations Committee should look at what we've just passed and see where there is duplication and cut $12 billion out of the spending bill. And then we will be setting the precedent, Mr. President, that we are going back to fiscal responsibility, which is setting a budget and having a reasonable increase, the rate of inflation, which has been the normal procedure here until this year. When you look at the bill that is before us, it would cost about $408 billion, according to the Congressional Budget Office. When you account for the previous continuing resolution, which provided funding for defense, military construction, Veterans Affairs, and Homeland Security, the top line FY09 spending level would exceed $1 trillion. This does not include last year's supplemental, nor the stimulus which we have just passed, which, when you combine those bills, would be another total of $1.4 trillion. That is a 49% increase over 1 year's period. If we want to exclude the emergency or one-time actions like supplementals or the stimulus, then you would have an increase over last year's spending by $83 billion, which would be an 8.8% increase over last year's spending. That's more than twice the rate of inflation at 3.8%. So, Mr. President, let's take some examples, because I will look at my committee, Commerce Committee, and the areas of my jurisdiction. Commerce Committee, we authorize broadband grants. We share this jurisdiction with the Agriculture Committee. We provided a total of $7.2 billion for broadband grants and loans in the stimulus package, $4.7 billion for the NTIA, and $2.5 billion for rural utility service. And yet, in this bill, we are adding another $400 million. That's a total for the FY09 spending of 4,500% increase. Now, why do we need another $400 million when we haven't even begun to spend the $7.2 billion from the stimulus yet? How about the Institute for Standards and Technology? This is a program that I support. It's a valid program, just like the previous one. Here we are increasing the NIST funding by $31 million over last year's funding level. But we just gave NIST $220 million not 2 weeks ago. So the Institute of Standards and Technology would be increased by not $31 million, but $251 million over 1 year period. These are just some of the items in my own committee jurisdiction. There are 122 accounts in this bill that received stimulus funding. Mr. President, I support most of what is in this bill because the Appropriations Committee took up these spending bills last year. We had the ability to amend in most cases, and we know what is in those bills. However, they were increased on the House side since we took them up last year, and now we have, just between now and October 1 of this year, this spending bill for all of the accounts except the security accounts. So why don't we show to the American people that we are going to exercise fiscal restraint, that we know that we've just passed $1 trillion in stimulus spending, some of which arguably is stimulus and some of which arguably is not. But we passed that stimulus bill, and it is going to cost our taxpayers $1 trillion. We hope that it will increase the revenue because we hope that it will increase jobs and will keep people in their jobs. That's what we want it to do. Now we are in the regular appropriations cycle from today until October 1st, and we're talking about $408 billion more in spending, some of which has already been provided for in the stimulus package we just passed. So the American people, some of whom have just lost their jobs, some of whom have just received notice that their mortgages are going to be foreclosed and their homes are going to be taken, and they're saying, what are they doing up there? How can they spend money like that without any regard to what is fiscal responsibility and how we're going to pay it off because it's more debt and we're going to increase interest, which everyone who owns something and has a mortgage understands. Mr. President, we don't have to do this. We can say today, in a bipartisan way, we're going to turn a new page. We're going to turn a new page in this Congress, and the Appropriations Committee is going to do its work. The Appropriations Committee is going to, in a bipartisan way, start looking at this $408 billion bill and compare it to the 122 accounts in this bill that got stimulus 2 weeks ago, and we're going to find $12 billion in cuts. $12 billion out of $408 billion. And it could come out of the stimulus. If that were the preferred way to go, we could go back into the stimulus in the out years. It doesn't have to be in the next 2 years. It can be in the out years of the stimulus. We have the Appropriations Committee, which would be authorized to go into either bill and just shrink $12 billion. It just seems almost unthinkable that we would not be able to cut $12 billion out of $1,408 million of taxpayer money that is coming out of Washington and is debt because we don't have the money to pay for it right now at all. So, Mr. President, I urge my colleagues to pass this amendment. Let's show the American people that we do understand that we should have fiscal responsibility and restraint, just as every household in this country is experiencing right now, and that from now forward, our appropriations bills are going to be in the regular order, that we're going to have a budget and we're going to live with that budget, and we're not going to add 5% or 8% and then just bring it over here and pass it with no amendments. That is business as usual. That is not change. It is not bipartisanship. And, Mr. President, it's not acceptable. Mr. President, I yield the floor and reserve the balance of my time.